My grandfather always said a man's land is his kingdom. I defended mine, but not from armies or dragons. I defended it from suburban sprawl, a smug HOA president, and a buried secret that threatened to steal everything. My grandfather always said a man's land is his kingdom. He wasn't a king, not by a long shot. He was a farmer, a black man who'd clawed and saved his entire life to buy this patch of Georgia soil, back when folks like us weren't supposed to own anything more than the clothes on our backs. He poured his sweat, his blood, and his soul into this land, and when he passed he left it to me, not just the 100 acres of rich red clay, but the legacy that came with it. It was my duty to protect it, to nurture it, to make sure his kingdom endured. For 10 years, I did just that. It was peaceful. The biggest problems I had were droughts and the occasional stubborn tractor engine. Then they built the meadows at Whispering Pines. It rose up like a beige-colored fungus on my western border, a sprawling development of identical houses with manicured lawns that looked like they were cut with nail scissors. With the houses came the Homeowners Association, and with the HOA came Brenda. Brenda was the HOA president, a woman whose lips were perpetually pursed in disapproval and who wore a tennis visor no matter the weather. From our first meeting, I knew she saw my farm not as a piece of local history, but as an eyesore, a blemish on her perfect suburban canvas. The complaints started small. A polite, passive-aggressive email about the aromatic profile of my fertilizer. I use organic compost, same as my granddaddy did. It smells like earth, like life. To them, it was a nuisance. Then it was the sound of my tractor. Apparently, my 6 a.m. start time was disrupting their morning meditation. I explained that fields don't plow themselves and the sun waits for no man. Brenda just smiled a tight little smile and said, "We'll see about that." The letters started getting more official, citing bylaws I wasn't subject to, making veiled threats about property values. They complained about my fence, a sturdy, rustic thing my grandfather and I built with our own hands. They called it dilapidated. They complained about my rooster, a proud old bird named General Forrest, who had the audacity to crow at dawn. They were trying to squeeze me, to make my life so miserable that I'd sell the last piece of my family's legacy to their developer buddy, who I knew was just salivating at the thought of turning my grandfather's kingdom into the Meadows Phase 2. I ignored them mostly. I was on my land, following the law. They could send all the angry letters they wanted. But then, one sweltering August afternoon, I noticed something was off. I was walking my western fence line, the one that bordered their precious development, checking for damage after a thunderstorm. Near the old oak tree that marked the corner of my property, the ground felt soft, spongy. That wasn't right. The clay here is usually hard as a rock this time of year. I looked closer. The grass was disturbed, laid back down in a way that was too neat, too deliberate. It was a scar, hiding in plain sight. My heart started a low, heavy drum against my ribs. I ran back to the barn, grabbed a shovel, and returned to the spot. The first scoop of dirt was loose, unnatural. The second, the same. On the third, the shovel hit something hard with a dull thunk. It wasn't a rock. I dug around it, my hands sweating, my breath coming in short, angry bursts. Slowly, I uncovered a thick black plastic conduit, about 6 inches in diameter. It was buried about 3 feet deep, running from the direction of the meadows, cutting straight across the corner of my property and heading out toward the main road. They hadn't just trespassed, they had excavated. They had installed infrastructure under my land, my kingdom, without a word, without my permission. The sheer arrogance of it stole my breath. This was a declaration of war. I filled the hole back in, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible. That night I couldn't sleep. The next morning I put on a clean shirt, tucked the dirt-stained photos I'd taken into my pocket, and drove to the sterile little community clubhouse that served as the HOA's seat of power. Brenda was there, of course, presiding over a stack of paperwork. She looked up, her expression a perfect blend of annoyance and surprise. "Joseph, to what do we owe the pleasure?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I slapped the photos down on her desk. They showed the unearthed conduit, the property marker, clear as day, just a few feet away. "What is this, Brenda?" She barely glanced at them. A slow, smug smile spread across her face, a smile that made my blood run cold. "Oh, that," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "A simple utility line. We're upgrading our community to an exclusive fiber optic network for our residents." "Your residents," I said, my voice dangerously low. "On my land. You dug on my land without my permission. That's illegal." Brenda leaned back in her chair, the smile never leaving her face. She looked at me like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "Actually," she said, steepling her fingers, "it's perfectly legal. Our lawyers were very thorough. They found a fascinating little agricultural right-of-way clause in the county records from the 1950s. It gives the county broad authority to grant utility easements across undeveloped farmland bordering new residential zones. And as a gesture of civic partnership, we made a very generous donation to the county's beautification fund. The deal is done, Joseph. There's not a single thing you can do about it." I walked out of that clubhouse with her smug laughter echoing in my ears. The Georgia sun beat down on the asphalt, but a cold fury was spreading through my veins. A 1950s clause. She said it with such confidence, as if she were quoting scripture. She was banking on the idea that a simple farmer like me wouldn't know the law, that I'd just roll over and accept it. She was banking on the idea that history was on her side, a history where clauses were written to keep men like my grandfather in their place. But she didn't know my grandfather, and she damn sure didn't know me. He taught me that the devil is always in the details, especially when it comes to paper and promises. So I drove straight to the county records office. It was a musty old building that smelled of decaying paper and indifference. The clerk behind the counter looked at me over his glasses like I was a bug he was considering squashing. I asked for the easement records for my property parcel. He sighed, took a long swallow of his coffee, and eventually pointed me toward a dusty corner filled with heavy, leather-bound ledgers. It took me 3 hours. My hands were gray with dust, and my eyes burned from staring at cursive that looped and faded across yellowed pages. But I found it. A right-of-way easement granted to the county in 1958. On the surface, Brenda was right. It gave the county the authority to grant access for essential public utilities. My heart sank. It was all there in black and white. It felt like a ghost from the past had reached out to help them steal a piece of my future. I was about to give up, to accept that they'd beaten me with a 50-year-old piece of paper and a well-placed donation. But then I saw it, tucked into the fine print, a single beautiful phrase my granddaddy would have loved. Provided such utilities serve the general public interest and are maintained by a public entity. The Meadows at Whispering Pines was a private, gated community. Their exclusive fiber optic network was just for them, and the HOA was a private corporation, not a public entity like the water or electric company. They weren't serving the general public. They were serving themselves. They had twisted the spirit of the law to suit their own greed, assuming no one would ever bother to read the fine print. They had used a public easement for a private enterprise, and that, I knew, was my leverage. That was their fatal mistake. The next day, I didn't call Brenda. I didn't send a letter. Instead, I called my cousin Earl, who runs a construction business, and I paid a visit to an old friend of my father's, a lawyer named Marcus who had a reputation for chewing up HOAs and spitting them out. I showed Marcus the paperwork. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Oh, Joseph," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They have no idea who they're messing with, do they? We're going to have some fun with this." A week later, things started to happen on my western fence line. First, a surveyor crew spent a full day driving stakes into the ground, marking out a massive 200 by 200-foot rectangle. The marked area started just inches from their pristine white vinyl fence and ran right over the path of their precious fiber optic cable. The residents of the meadows watched from their windows, whispering and pointing. The next morning, Earl's biggest, meanest-looking excavator rumbled onto my property, its tracks leaving deep impressions in the red clay. The operator, a guy named Tiny, who was anything but, gave me a nod and got to work. He lowered the massive bucket and began to dig. Not a small trench, a giant pit. The ground shuddered with each scoop, the diesel engine a constant roar that drowned out the chirping birds, and I hoped any chance of a peaceful morning meditation. It didn't take long for Brenda to appear. She stormed across the manicured lawn, her tennis visor pulled down low like a warrior's helmet. Two other HOA board members trailed behind her like nervous little squirrels. "Joseph, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" she shrieked over the engine noise. I leaned against my grandfather's old fence post, took a slow sip of my coffee, and gave her my calmest smile. "Morning, Brenda. Beautiful day, isn't it? I'm just starting a new project. A little expansion." "An expansion? Of what?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the giant, ever-deepening hole. "You're digging right over our utility line. You'll destroy it." "Your utility line?" I asked, feigning innocence. "Brenda, this is my land. I can dig wherever I please, and according to my survey, this is the prime spot for my new facility." Her face was turning a blotchy red. "Facility? What facility? You stop this at once." I took another slow sip of coffee and looked her dead in the eye. The excavator roared as it pulled up another bucket of earth, moving ever closer to their buried cable. "Well, since you and your friends were so concerned about the aromatic profile of my farm," I said, letting the smile spread across my face, "I decided to diversify. This here is going to be the future home of the finest, most productive commercial hog operation in the entire state. I'm thinking 100 prime hogs to start. The smell of progress, Brenda. And bacon." The color drained from Brenda's face. The word hogs hung in the air between us, thick and heavy like the Georgia humidity. The two board members behind her exchanged horrified looks. 100 hogs, just feet from their meticulously landscaped backyards, their outdoor kitchens, their pristine swimming pools. They could almost smell it already. "You can't be serious," she sputtered, her voice a strangled whisper. "Hogs? Right here? That's barbaric. The smell, the noise, it will ruin our property values." "My property, my values," I said, shrugging. "And my lawyer, Marcus, says my agricultural zoning is ironclad. In fact, he found a county grant program to encourage small-scale livestock farming. Very pro-business. It's a done deal. Permits are already filed." I gestured toward the pit. "Earl's just digging the foundation for the waste lagoon. Got to have a place for all that organic fertilizer." For the first time since I'd met her, Brenda was speechless. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. She looked at the deep, muddy hole, then at my face, searching for a bluff and finding none. She saw the glint in my eye, the same stubborn determination she'd mistaken for ignorance. She saw a man who had been pushed too far, a man standing on his grandfather's kingdom, ready to burn it all down just to watch her perfect world choke on the smoke. She and her cronies scrambled back toward their beige sanctuary, their shouted threats about lawsuits and injunctions barely audible over the triumphant roar of the excavator. For the rest of the day, Tiny kept digging. The pit grew deeper and wider. I watched as anxious faces appeared in the windows of the meadows. Phone calls were made. Cars came and went. The anthill had been kicked, and the ants were in a frenzy. By sunset, the pit was a monstrous thing, a testament to my resolve. I had Earl park the excavator right at the edge, its giant bucket looming over their fence line like a guillotine. Then I went home and had my first peaceful night's sleep in weeks. The next morning my phone rang. It was Marcus. "They're ready to talk," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. We met at his office. No clubhouse this time. This was my turf. Brenda and two terrified-looking men from their developer's company sat on one side of a polished mahogany table. They looked like they hadn't slept. I sat on the other side with Marcus, calm and collected. Brenda tried to bluster at first, talking about legal action and nuisance ordinances. Marcus just smiled, slid a thick folder across the table, and said, "Let's talk about felony trespass, illegal excavation, and the fraudulent use of a public easement for private commercial gain. My client's damages start at about $200,000 for the trespass and devaluation of his land. And that's before we file for punitive damages. I imagine the local news would love a story about a wealthy gated community and a big developer using a racist Jim Crow-era law to cheat a black farmer out of his family's land. How do you think that headline will look for your Phase 2 investors?" Silence. The developer's suits paled. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. They had been so sure of their power, so sure of their clever little legal loophole, that they never considered what it would look like in the light of day. The negotiations didn't take long after that. Their fight was gone. They were backed into a corner, and the only way out was through me. 2 weeks later, the deal was done. They paid me a settlement of $250,000 for the accidental trespass. They paid Earl to fill in the giant hole he had dug. They paid a crew under my direct supervision to come onto my land, dig up every inch of their precious fiber optic cable, and reroute it, legally, along the public road at a massive extra expense. And the final piece, the part that mattered most to me, was a brand new 10-foot-high privacy fence paid for by the HOA, running the entire length of my western border. It was built of solid, treated oak, a fortress wall between my grandfather's kingdom and their plastic paradise. The day the last board was nailed into place, I walked the fence line. The air was quiet. The only sound the low buzz of insects and the familiar crow of General Forest in the distance. On the other side of the fence I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the meadows, a lawnmower, a distant splash from a pool. But they were in their world, and I was in mine. I leaned against the new fence, the solid wood warm from the sun. I thought about my granddaddy, about the sweat and soul he poured into this soil. Brenda had seen a blemish, an obstacle, but all I saw was home. They thought their money and their lawyers made them powerful. But they forgot one thing my grandfather always taught me. Nothing is more powerful than a man defending his own land. He had built this kingdom, and I had protected it. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across my peaceful fields, I knew he would have been proud.